During the deadly air battles of World War II, being one of Japan's infamous kamikaze pilots wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Compelled and conditioned to make the ultimate sacrifice in the service of Emperor Hirohito, young pilots embarked on deadly suicide missions throughout World War II. Today, we're looking at the short, complicated lives of Japan's kamikaze pilots. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other World War II topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's head back to World War II. Japan's kamikaze forces are infamous for the damage and destruction they caused to American fleets during the war. But there is a very sad and human story behind their actions. Known as the Tokutai in Japan, kamikaze forces were led by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who believed the only way to assure any kind of victory for the Japanese was to use their planes and bombs to organize suicide attacks against the enemy. Thus, the idea of the Special Attack Forces was born. They took the name from the legendary Divine Wind that protected Japan from Kublai Khan's invading Mongol army. The idea was that the force would consist of volunteers, but building a force of kamikaze pilots wasn't as simple as that. Some pilots enthusiastically volunteered, but that wasn't the norm. Potential pilots received a notice containing 3 options: volunteer with a strong desire, simply volunteer, or decline. The papers also contained something else: the name of the pilot. This made it much more difficult to decline the offer. The pressure to volunteer was intense. Sometimes the Army asked a room full of potential pilots who didn't want to volunteer. In these situations, peer pressure and the norms of Japanese society made it much more difficult to decline. Declining might make a soldier's life miserable for the immediate future, and in some cases, saying no didn't work anyway. One soldier, Amiko Onukotirni, wrote about this experience in his book Kamikaze Diaries, writing, "Kuroda Kenjiro decided not to volunteer, only to be taken by surprise when he found his name on the list of volunteers for the Mitate Navy Tokutai Corps. His superior had reported proudly that all the members of his corps had volunteered. That kind of thing happened often, and many of the pilots believed sacrificing themselves in battle would earn them a place at Japan's Yasukuni Shrine, a resting place to honor Japan's dead. The Yasukuni Shrine gets mentioned often in the writings of kamikaze pilots, and it's presently home to 2,466,000 divinities, soldiers who perished in various Japanese wars. Soldiers from other countries are expected to fight for their country in times of war, but the Japanese soldiers had a different set of expectations. Before 1945, the emperor was seen as a living god under Japan's Shinto religion. This unquestioning loyalty to the emperor meant they'd fight and die for him above all else. The pilots were expected to accept and embrace their death as true patriots of Japan. Some of them did so with honor. A few even kept a samurai sword and a picture of the emperor in their cockpits while in flight. Kamikaze pilots demonstrated this sense of loyalty to Hirohito through attacks. Following World War II, Emperor Hirohito became a figurehead with no actual political power. But for a time before that, he was an influential figure in Japanese history. Becoming a Japanese soldier during the Second World War was a grim business. During the war, the Japanese military mandate was simple: death before surrender. When faced with capture, a Japanese pilot or soldier was trained to end their own lives rather than become a prisoner of war. But it wasn't through cyanide capsules or seppuku. Japanese forces trained personnel to use a rifle to accomplish the deed. This wasn't unique to kamikaze pilots. When facing inevitable defeat at the hands of the enemy, Japanese soldiers engaged in banzai charges. And things got ugly from there. If a soldier decided to flee instead, his comrades were required to shoot him from behind, ensuring there would be no capture or surrender. During wartime, soldiers from all sides write letters to home. In the case of a kamikaze pilot, however, the letter was an integral part of the mission. Before his mission, the kamikaze pilot's final act was to write a letter to his parents, wife, or family. After his mission, the family members were supposed to read the heavily censored letters. These writings captured the final thoughts of a pilot before he made his attack. Many letters and poems survive to this day, but only a handful have been translated into English. One such letter was written by Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa. the pilot of the second plane that took out the USS Bunker Hill, ultimately decommissioning the ship and wiping out over 300 crew members. The letter isn't quite what you'd expect from someone embarking on such a mission. Ogawa expressed gratitude to his parents and the honor he feels for being a member of the Special Attack Corps, writing, "Beyond those boundless white clouds, I will make my attack with a calm feeling. Not even thoughts of life and death will come to mind. A person dies once. It will be an honorable day to live for the eternal cause. Father and mother, please, be glad for me." The ensign signed off with a wish of good health to his mother, telling both parents he'd be watching over them at the Yasukuni Shrine, ending the letter with the phrase, "I will go smiling, both on the day of my sortie and forever." To this day, it's difficult to determine if these letters represent a pilot's true feelings or soldiers wrote them in a way that demonstrated the pilot's courage to their families. Other pilots wrote similar letters, but there was never a guarantee the military would pass them along to the pilots' families. Several books of these final writings were compiled, translated, and saved for posterity so that future generations can learn about the lives of these doomed men from a dark time in Japanese history. Serving in the Japanese Army could be cruel at times, especially since corporal punishment was baked into the framework of the armed forces. Beatings and violence were common among the ranks. Anything from a missing button to failure to snap to attention could ignite a superior officer's wrath. A soldier might receive a beating for standing on a newspaper photo of the emperor. While many Japanese soldiers were drafted into military service with some level of patriotism in their hearts, the beatings and regular punishments left indelible scars on the soldiers that would last a lifetime. And if that weren't bad enough, corporal punishment permeated the entire armed forces. Anyone above your rank might beat you for any reason. Their superiors would treat them the same way. And it went all the way up the ladder to Japan's Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. One kamikaze pilot named Hirokawa Daikikihi was drafted into military service, but never conducted a kamikaze mission. When he later became a historian, he wrote a harrowing account of the brutality he suffered while enlisted. One terrible incident occurred after his superiors accused his company of eating with local farmers to ease their hunger. He wrote, "Each of us was called into the officer's room. When my turn came, as soon as I entered the room, I was hit so hard that I could no longer see and fell to the floor. The minute I got up, I was hit again by a club so that I would confess. A friend of mine was thrown with his head first to the floor, lost consciousness, and was sent to a hospital. He never returned. All this savagery was orchestrated by the Corps commander, named Tsutsui. I am still looking for this fellow." During his training, he was struck in the face until it was no longer recognizable. One day in 1945, a fellow ensign hit him in the face repeatedly until his teeth badly cut the inside of his mouth. On another day, his unit was forced to sit on a frozen concrete floor and beaten with clubs. When the Special Attack Force first formed in 1944, no military academy-trained officers volunteered to join. So instead, the deadly kamikaze missions were left entirely up to the new recruits and junior personnel to take on the unpleasant role. Japan's kamikaze force consisted of approximately 4,000 kamikaze pilots. At least 3,000 of them were boy pilots that had recently been conscripted into the Japanese Army. Around 1,000 of them were student soldiers, whom the government decided to graduate from university early to make them eligible for the draft. These men were exceptionally well educated, spending most of their time at university reading and writing. As a result, most accounts of the reality of serving in the Special Attack Force come from these student soldiers. They probably didn't think about the enemy much at all, especially since most of them never saw actual combat. According to writer Yuki Tanaka of the Hiroshima Peace Institute, their diaries and letters don't often discuss their enemies. Instead, they offer a profoundly philosophical approach to describing their lives and experiences. There's no hatred of the enemy within their pages. Instead, they capture their struggle to understand their imminent deaths and come to terms with their fate. And in the end, they often pondered how to spend their remaining time in a meaningful way, and to justify the suicidal act they were required to make on behalf of their country. It may seem strange, but taking off on a kamikaze mission wasn't always a death sentence. Mechanical failure or engine problems required pilots to divert their flight and return to base. A lot of Japanese aircraft were old, outdated, and beginning to fail. As the war raged on, more pilots had to divert their missions due to these problems. Kamikaze pilot Takehiko Ena survived a few planned missions as a direct result of this policy. He was supposed to be part of a crew of 3, flying a bomber during Operation Kikasui. But luck was on Eina's side. On his first mission, he couldn't get his plane off the ground. His second mission didn't fare much better. Engine trouble forced an emergency landing. On the third time out, engine trouble forced a crash landing into the sea. Aina, his co-pilot, and the communications officer swam to nearby Kuroshima Island, where they stayed for nearly 3 months until a Japanese submarine picked them up. Aina was relieved he survived and felt optimistic about his future. After the war, the new U.S. written Constitution's Article 9 restricted Japan's military to a defensive role. 70 years later, he reflected on his experience, telling The Guardian, "For 70 years, we have been protected by a peace-oriented constitution. I'm very grateful that we haven't gone to war in that time. The Japanese people should be happy about that." His sentiment isn't unique among surviving kamikaze pilots, but it's strange to think that more kamikaze missions might have been successful if it weren't for their poorly maintained planes. While many young Japanese men were drafted into serving, firstborn sons weren't allowed to become kamikaze pilots. In 1944, firstborn sons got the opportunity to stay alive to carry on the family name. Everyone else was expected to sacrifice themselves to the service of the emperor. Second sons bore the brunt of kamikaze service. Okinawa native Paul Seneaki Nakamura volunteered for the Special Attack Force, training on a glider due to plane shortages. Nakamura was never called upon to conduct a mission of his own, and he survived the war. But he was far too poor to return to his home in Okinawa right away. When he finally made it back, he discovered all the first sons who'd remained behind during the war met their demise at the Battle of Okinawa. After his horrifying discovery, Nakamura became an Anglican priest and spread Christianity throughout the land. There was one ritual all kamikaze pilots practiced before their mission: a final ceremonial drink. Pilots drank a cup of sake or water before boarding their planes. In some ways, this is similar to the tradition of giving a man a blindfold and a cigarette before sending him to face the firing squad. A surviving pilot named Keiichi Kuwahara remembered the ceremonial drink and the mission he was supposed to fly afterward. As he flew out to sea, he looked back at his homeland with tears in his eyes. On his way to Okinawa to destroy an American warship, his plane experienced engine trouble and forced a crash landing. He later said, "I struggled to convince myself I had to die. I thought my death would be pointless. Even if Japan won the war, my family would die in the gutter because I would not be there to support them. It tormented me. I felt like I was losing my mind." We were told that rather than accept defeat, we should offer our lives. There was no choice. We had to follow orders when push came to shove, but we didn't wish for death. His second mission was also avoided due to engine failure. Kuwahara's gratitude for being alive far outweighed any dishonor or fear of poor treatment from other pilots. His guilt, however, stayed with him for a long time, and he continued to lay flowers every year for the kamikaze pilots who died during active service. After being trained as an intelligence officer and commando, Onoda was assigned to Lubang Island in the Philippines to blow up a bunch of important targets to prevent American troops from establishing a foothold. However, his orders were changed at the last minute, and the targets were left decidedly unexploded, allowing the Americans to easily invade Lubang in 1945. Resisting the urge to write "I told you so" on his hand and slap each of his superior officers must have taken all of Onoda's willpower. As the war in the Pacific raged on, soldiers died all around Onoda until only he and 3 other men were left. Suddenly finding himself the highest-ranking officer by process of literal elimination, he led his new squad up into the mountains to hide. Under strict orders to never surrender or commit suicide, Onoda and his 3 men had to either repel the American and Filipino forces or die trying. They ran regular guerrilla attacks in order to try and get one of those 2 things to happen. After Japan surrendered in September of 1945, news of the war's end reached the island. But Onoda and his men refused to believe it, thinking the newspapers they saw were calculated lies designed to trick them into coming out of hiding. Onoda wasn't the only soldier to think this. There were stranded Japanese troops all over the Pacific who held out for a long time after the war was over. We're willing to bet Onoda is one of those guys who plays Monopoly until losing his very last dollar at 3 in the morning. Most of Onoda's men were just as dedicated as he was to continue fighting a war that was currently being taught in the history classes around the world, but they eventually fell off one by one until only he was left. The first, Private Akatsu, surrendered to Filipino authorities in 1950, a full 5 years after World War II had ended. Corporal Shimada was shot by a patrol out looking for Onoda and his men in 1954, and Private First Class Kozuka was killed by police while on a mission to burn local crops in 1972, nearly 2 decades after the surrender. For perspective, Onoda and his men hid out in the wilderness fighting an imaginary war longer than the Beatles were together. Onoda became something of a boogeyman, regularly popping out of the jungle like the predator to attack farmers and police for decades. He even cut one farmer's head off for basically no other reason than shock and awe. Onoda later justified his actions as standard war tactics for the conflict he believed was still raging on, saying, "I materialized to destroy things, threatening them, lighting fires in empty houses." Needless to say, Onoda and his men didn't have much in the way of standard supplies when they ran off into the jungle to fight World War II for 30 additional years, but they were well-trained survivalists. They lived primarily off of fruits and vegetables gathered from the wilderness and the occasional cow stolen from local farmers. They built huts out of bamboo and maintained their weapons and uniforms as if they expected a superior officer to show up at any moment and conduct an inspection. And they absolutely refused to believe any information about the end of the war or the progression of the modern world. So presumably, Onoda and his men also thought the moon landing was a hoax. Onoda had been declared dead by the Japanese government in 1959, but after PFC Kozuka's death in 1972, they were forced to reevaluate that position. The Japanese media took hold of the idea that Onoda might still be alive, and he became something of an urban myth. In 1974, a young man named Norio Suzuki announced he was going on a quest to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Incredibly, Suzuki managed to find Onoda and managed to get Onoda to consider the idea that the war might actually be over. Onoda agreed not to kill Suzuki, but insisted that he couldn't abandon his mission until he received an official order from his commander, so Suzuki returned to Japan to find him. Suzuki's amazing luck held out, and he managed to locate Onoda's former commander, Major Taniguchi, working in a bookstore. Together with Suzuki and Onoda's brother, Taniguchi went to Lubang Island to tell Onoda to hang it up. At first, Onoda thought the whole thing was another elaborate trick and waited intently for Taniguchi to slide him some kind of secret message letting him know that the war was still being fought. When it became apparent that no such message was coming, that Taniguchi's order to surrender was legit, and that the war had ended 29 years ago, Onoda blacked out. All things considered, he took it pretty well. Onoda's surrender looked like it might be a tricky thing, because he'd been essentially terrorizing the country for 30 years and had killed at least 7 Filipino citizens. But President of the Philippines, wowed by Onoda's iron will and tenacity, granted him a full pardon. Onoda donned the uniform he'd kept in the jungle for 30 years and presented his sword to the president in person, who applauded Onoda's courage and respectfully gave the sword back. Upon his return to Japan, Onoda was given a hero's welcome. He was flown home on a private flight and stepped out to cheering crowds, including his parents and the daughter of Corporal Shimada, one of Onoda's 3 troops who had been killed decades earlier. The Japanese media adored Onoda, writing glowing headlines about his incredible story and holding him up as an inspirational symbol of duty for country to a generation that had grown decidedly more materialistic during the 30 years Onoda was hiding out in the jungle. He even wrote a book about his ordeal titled No Surrender that should be required reading for anyone who has ever complained about having to work overtime. Onoda immediately found life in modern Japan overwhelming. Bear in mind, he had been living in the wilderness, completely cut off from society for 3 decades. So he was essentially stepping out of a time machine 30 years into the future. Rather than trying to figure out how to use a television, Onoda moved with his brother to a Japanese community in Brazil and became a cattle farmer, which was way more his speed. He even got married to a woman who taught ancient Japanese customs because he was old school, extremely old school. After hearing about a 19-year-old kid who murdered his parents after failing to get into college, Onoda was horrified and moved back to Japan to start a camp to help inspire troubled children. He felt the murder was a sign that the current generation was weak and lacked confidence, which is a skill he felt he could teach because you don't spend 30 years fighting a war alone in the wilderness if you don't believe in yourself. The camp was called Onoda Nature Camp, and he taught his campers the survivalist skills he'd used to stay alive while hiding out in the Philippines all those years, believing the knowledge would empower them and boost their confidence. He also started lecturing at schools and universities about his experience, imparting his philosophy that nature was the key to finding your purpose in life. Onoda was given a full military pension and made a decent amount of royalties from his book, but he refused to accept the 29 years of back pay technically owed him by the government. People would send him private donations that he also refused, donating any money he couldn't return to a Shinto memorial shrine. Onoda finally passed away in 2014. Hiroo Onoda took his duty as a soldier so seriously that he refused to believe World War II was over until he heard it from the mouth of his commanding officer 29 years later. Wartime conditions invariably attract insects, and those insects spread disease. To counteract that spread, the National Institute of Health in the United States and its global counterparts took steps to prevent potential epidemics. During the late 1930s, Swiss scientists at the Geigy Company developed an insecticide called dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, which is better known as DDT. The chemist who came up with the concoction, Paul Muller, even won a Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 1948 for his efforts. DDT was soon sent to the United States, where an epidemiologist named Dr. Fred Sober became one of its biggest proponents, even persuading the Egyptian government to use it to fight a malaria outbreak in 1943 and 1944. With additional support from the Rockefeller Foundation and other allied countries, DDT was being dropped directly on millions of civilians and servicemen alike in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia by 1944. The thing about DDT was that it was easy to manufacture, affordable, and effective. The colorless, nearly odorless chemical wiped out lice, mosquitoes, mites, and other bugs, exponentially decreasing the spread of diseases such as malaria and typhus. The immediate success of DDT saved millions of lives and was touted as a solution to typhus, the dreaded plague that had followed in the wake of every great war in history. DDT's success on the field resulted in widespread demand for the product, which became available to the public during the late 1940s. Everyone from governments to farmers to backyard gardeners used DDT in abundance, spraying it in the direction of people, plants, and animals. While the public was warned of its potential to upset the balance of nature, the long-term consequences of DDT remained unknown. In the years after the First World War, the United States government established permanent laundries and dry cleaning facilities at many of its bases around the country. And once World War II broke out, laundry services were extended overseas. At Camp Lee in Virginia, troops were trained to use mobile laundry machines over 12 weeks. After completing the training, laundry units, made up of 3 officers and 85 enlisted men, were dispatched. From 1940 forward, mobile laundries resembling semi-trucks contained as many as 6 units and could wash roughly 125 pounds of clothes each hour. Officers, enlisted men, and some civilians could pay to have their clothes washed, although the former received preferential treatment. Men paid 50 cents per bundle, as legislation to have laundry service free of charge failed to come to fruition. That's right, they charged their own soldiers to wash their clothes. Servicemen also had access to public shower facilities. Much like laundries, showers were intended to keep them clean in the interest of combating lice and other infestations while simultaneously boosting morale. Shower facilities could have between 8 and 24 shower heads, with additional fumigation areas available. Venereal disease was widespread during World War II, and many veterans brought syphilis and gonorrhea home with them. As a result, U.S. officials made concerted efforts to help servicemen make sound decisions, to conduct medical tests, and to keep detailed records of venereal disease outbreaks. The more active approach, called the 8-Point Agreement, helped make solicitation in the proximity of bases a federal offense, established rapid treatment centers for venereal disease, and fostered strategies for treating disease while allowing men to stay on active duty. Servicemen also gained access to penicillin, a relatively new drug purported to have vast success against venereal diseases, alongside standard arsenic and sulfur treatments. The United States War Department, for their part, started distributing pamphlets with much more explicit information than had ever been extended to men in service. Men were instructed on how to clean themselves, informed about prophylaxis options, and told to seek treatment immediately should symptoms of a venereal disease arise. The soldiers were also told that, at the end of the day, the best way to avoid venereal disease was just to stay away from women. Hard to argue with that logic. Trench foot is a serious condition that results from a person's feet being wet for long periods of time. And because it had been such a big problem during World War I, the military wanted to give men a way to keep their feet dry and warm. Women in Britain were encouraged to make socks for servicemen, while textile factories shifted production to accommodate the need. In the United States, the shoe pack system was implemented in 1944, giving men a waterproof, lined boot. The shoe pack included rubber and leather layers with felt on the inside of the shoe to maintain warmth. Shoe packs were made by LL Bean, a variation of its main hunting shoe. There weren't always enough shoe packs to go around, and sometimes the sizes didn't match the need, but they proved effective as long as men wore wool socks and changed them regularly. The lack of ventilation in the shoe pack necessitated the frequent changing of socks, lest the owners develop macerated feet or shoe pack foot, with the skin on the bottoms of their feet resembling wet blotting paper. The military also established shoe repair teams, giving servicemen an opportunity to have quality fixes on their footwear. Whereas during World War I, the men had to rely on local contractors who often provided sub-quality work with inadequate materials. Keeping men clean, tidy, and presentable, according to the regulations of the War Department in 1942, meant teeth had to be brushed at least once a day. Necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, also known as trench mouth, was a common affliction during World War I, and it remained common in World War II. Caused by stress, a lack of dental care, and malnutrition, trench mouth resulted in bleeding, pain, and gum decay. There were numerous efforts to try to combat trench mouth. Tooth powder became a regular feature in hygiene kits, and the men were continually ordered to brush their teeth every day, a practice many continued after they returned home. Troops were also given toothpaste, something that had previously been a luxury item. In fact, after its dissemination during World War II, toothpaste became much more popular among all social classes. Additional items in hygiene kits included a toothbrush, razor blades, toilet soap, and shaving cream. Men were also given chewing gum, candy, tobacco, matches, and cigarettes. Another item that unfortunately became a habit many soldiers took home with them. During World War II, the same regulations were in place for personal hygiene that had been present in earlier decades, but the techniques used to teach those regulations varied significantly. When servicemen began their hygiene training, they watched a film that showed them how to clean themselves in hopes of promoting a sense of personal and unit hygiene. Once units received their orders and knew their destination, they were then given site-specific hygiene training. Troops going to Europe, for example, were given information about typhus and trench foot through a series of visual aids, while those bound for the Pacific Theater were informed about malaria, water safety, and parasites. The use of visual media to promote public health wasn't an innovation by the military, as posters, pamphlets, and displays were used in abundance during the 1930s. However, the outbreak of World War II brought motion picture companies and the armed forces together. The U.S. Army even took over Kaufman Astoria Films in New York to make training films and propaganda pictures, while the Air Force used Hell Roach Studios in California. The videos were both comically entertaining and informative. Characters like Private Snafu and Private McGillicuddy offered commandments for cleanliness and health alongside cautionary tales of what could go wrong. The War Department did not hold back on using motion pictures to educate about venereal disease either. The STD film, explicit in content, offered a simple and straightforward account of the effects of venereal disease which may result from intercourse. Servicemen were told they needed to watch, understand, and internalize the film if our country is to successfully defend our right to live the American way. There were mixed messages for United States personnel during World War II, especially when it came to water. With repeated instruction to stay clean, servicemen used local water sources to wash themselves and their clothing when the opportunity arose. This wasn't without risks, however. Local water use often resulted in parasites, skin infections, and other health problems. On the island of Leyte in the Philippines, for example, men were told to avoid fresh water for swimming and washing clothes due to the high risk of schistosomiasis, also known as snail fever. Schistosomiasis, also seen in troops in North Africa, was caused by a parasitic flatworm infiltrating the urinary or digestive systems, which is super not fun to think about. Anyway, as a result of schistosomiasis outbreaks, the military tightened restrictions on water use, issuing orders that all water used by troops will be obtained from approved water points, to include water used for drinking, bathing, laundry, washing of vehicles, or floors. Wading, bathing, and washing of clothing by troops in any freshwater river, swamp pool, or rice field is prohibited. The military also issued rubber boots and protective gear for engineers and soldiers serving in at-risk areas. In line with other educational programs at the time, they also put out cartoons emphasizing the need for prevention of snail fever. In terms of keeping food preparation as clean as possible, there were regulations against taking food from civilians and from eating at certain restaurants. In the United Kingdom, for example, American troops could buy food from public restaurants, but this was prohibited on the continent. That being said, keeping sanitary standards up while away from camp was difficult, to say the least. Commanders knew that enlisted men obtained food and water from unauthorized sources, even though this was strictly prohibited. This was especially true as rations featured fewer meats, fruits, and overall variety later into the conflict. To increase the standards of food quality and cleanliness, kitchen personnel were trained at special schools before being sent to overseas camps. A group of sanitation experts made regular visits to mess halls to ensure cooks and food preparers kept themselves and the food clean. Officials took great care developing effective and efficient techniques to streamline cafeteria lines. Orders were dispatched with respect to how to use in-place utensils. And medical personnel had the authority to conduct extra examinations of food handlers as needed. How effective all these precautions against food-borne illnesses were is a matter of debate. Over the course of the war, there were 190 recorded outbreaks of food poisoning reported, involving over 22,000 individuals. Throughout the war, the general standard for servicemen was to bathe daily while in garrison and in the field at least once weekly. The hair will be kept short and the beard neatly trimmed. This posed a difficult choice for many, especially in places where water was limited, such as North Africa. For British troops, the choice of what to do with water was to decide whether to make tea with the shaving water or to shave in the tea. German troops in North Africa were given a gallon each day, an insufficient amount during hot summer months. American troops, like many of their international counterparts, were given razors and shaving cream with their hygiene kits, items they may have carried around in a cigar box or some comparable container. Military barbers used supplies as they became available, sometimes resorting to using the equipment family members sent from home. Men could visit local barbers, but the U.S. military tried to prevent them from getting haircuts or shaves from facilities deemed unsanitary. It was only after the U.S. Army enforced the prohibition on visiting restricted barbershops that the barbers began to adhere to more sanitary practices. Even from all the way across the Atlantic, Great Britain's ability to defeat the Nazis alone looked questionable. Concerned that the U.S. Army wasn't prepared for what lay ahead, Americans began to support the idea of instituting a draft. So, on September 16, 1940, the United States Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act, also known as the Burke-Wadsworth Act, restoring the military draft previously in effect during World War I. The new law ordered all males between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for service. Draftees would then be selected by a national lottery. Seriously, the Secretary of War would draw numbers out of a bowl, and the President would read them aloud, like a raffle ticket at a school carnival. Each of the over 6,000 draft boards would look up what local man in their area had been assigned that number, and that person was then officially drafted. Those men who were selected were expected to serve for at least 1 year. But once the U.S. officially entered World War II, the period of service was extended to encompass the duration of the conflict, and the average duration of service would ultimately turn out to be 33 months. As the war dragged on, the draft age was lowered to 18, and by 1944, deferments for men younger than 26 were nearly non-existent. And while the law passed did define a draft system that was racially blind, the military at the time was segregated. And through delaying the assignment of drafted black men to their limited options in the military, blacks were underrepresented in the war effort. In 1943, however, a racial quota system was introduced to gain more complete participation of the nation's manpower. To make sure the military's needs were always being met, the draft board got to decide to which military branch draftees would be assigned, and more often than not, that was Army infantry. By the time the war ended, 50 million men had registered, and 10 million had been inducted into the armed forces. Turning those civilians into an effective army was no small task. Most of the recruits were young and had never left their home state, much less traveled across the world to fight a war. Making them into soldiers started with several months of basic training known as boot camp. To get the trainees to start thinking of themselves as part of a unit, the men all received standardized uniforms and equipment, had their heads shaved, and were assigned serial numbers. Platoons would then eat, sleep, and train together. The training was overseen by drill instructors, tough-as-nails officers who forced their trainees to be attentive to protocol. Think of R. Lee Emery's character in Full Metal Jacket. That movie was about the Marines, but you get the picture. Recruits who made mistakes would be punished with extra kitchen duty or other physical tasks, and if a mistake were bad enough, the whole platoon might be punished for it. It was a grueling experience, but many veterans remember boot camp as a transformative experience that left them ready to fight anything, including long lines at the barber shop. After basic training, most recruits were given more specialized training in their specific duties, including how to use special weapons, operate a radio, or master particular invasion techniques. Specialties were assigned based on past experience and the results of the AGCT, or Army General Classification Test. The test purported to identify a recruit's skills or trainability, though how well it worked is still up for debate. Once specialties were assigned, recruits might train at over a half-dozen different locations before being shipped out, and sometimes they even received additional training after arriving at their destination. Despite being just a small fraction of the Army, infantrymen incurred the vast majority of the casualties and typically faced the harshest conditions. And they were paid less than their counterparts in other services and occupations. That doesn't sound right. Seems like you should at least get a good job for not dying bonus. As you might imagine, the state of affairs didn't sit so well with the men and led to a deterioration of morale. To combat those bad vibes, the top brass employed a multi-pronged strategy that included awarding badges for proficiency in training and performance in combat, as well as an increased rate of promotion. Famous American war correspondent Ernie Pyle led the political battle to get infantrymen a financial reward for the risks they were taking by using his column to dramatize the conditions they faced. His advocacy helped bring about the institution of badge pay in June of 1944. Badge pay awarded $5 per month to anyone who achieved the Expert Infantryman Badge, roughly $85 today, and $10 per month for the Combat Infantryman Badge, which equals about $175 in 2022. It's not the kind of money that was going to make anyone rich, but it was better than nothing. An infantryman had to be prepared to move through any terrain, not to mention any weather. Troops had to deal with snow, rain, blistering heat, freezing cold, and every other conceivable condition and climate. This meant that along with his M1 rifle, which weighed over 10 pounds when loaded, every man had to carry over 20 pounds of clothing, including underwear, long johns, woolen pants, a wool shirt, at least one heavy sweater, several pairs of socks, boots, galoshes, a rain poncho, an overcoat, a cap, and a helmet. And a swimsuit, just in case. Then there was the additional 60 pounds of equipment, including a backpack, an ammunition bandolier, grenades, rations, a canteen, a blanket, and assorted personal items, among other things. Most important among all these items were the clean socks. No, really. Marching through mud and snow caused blisters and trench foot, and wearing waterproof boots caused the feet to sweat, which led to the same ailments. These were serious problems because, in addition to being painful, blisters also created a risk of infection. Given the dangers of infection in the field, soldiers were known to take every opportunity to change and clean their socks. Speaking of which, for soldiers in the field, bathing was an extremely rare luxury, and they sometimes went over a month without showering or changing their clothes. So, sort of like being a freshman in college. If a GI was given the chance to shower, it was usually by means of a Lister bag, which was a canvas sack with a shower head attached at the bottom. Lister bags, which would be suspended about 5 feet off the ground, held roughly 36 gallons of water. So forget about the idea of a long, luxurious shower. If he moved quickly, a soldier could just about lather himself up and rinse the soap off before the water ran out. And it was usually in his best interest to hurry anyway, since the blister bag had to be used outdoors, often in the freezing cold. Then, if he was lucky, he'd be issued some new, clean clothes, usually using water heated in a helmet above a camp stove, or with government-issued heating packs. Soldiers could shave themselves during lulls in the fighting. The government also issued them toothbrushes and tooth powder, which could be used with water from a canteen. That is, assuming it wasn't so cold the canteens had frozen, which was a regular occurrence. Despite the existence of military news services, infantrymen, and even their immediate supervisors, typically had little knowledge about how the overall war effort was going. Newspapers like Stars and Stripes rarely made it all the way to the front, and issues that did were usually long out of date. This meant there was no real way to know what the significance of any given mission or battle was. Soldiers were expected to risk their lives defending seemingly unimportant villages or taking some particular hill, even if they didn't understand why they were doing it. As Lord Alfred Tennyson wrote in his 1854 poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, theirs was not to reason why, but merely to do or die. You know, that quote from Saving Private Ryan. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. The war was over, but the work wasn't, not by a long shot. The army in Europe would now have to transition into being an occupational force. At the same time, the US was preparing for an invasion of Japan, which would require some troops to travel to a new theater of war. And of course, some troops were ready to be discharged and sent home. Recalling some of the difficulties the U.S. faced demobilizing after World War I, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall set out to devise a system to decide who would stay, who would head to Japan, and who would go home. The system he came up with was the Adjusted Service Rating Score, or the point system as it was called by the GIs. Announced in September of 1944, the system awarded soldiers 1 point for each month in service in the Army, 1 additional point for each month in service overseas, 5 points for each campaign, 5 points for a Medal of Merit or Valor, 5 points for a Purple Heart, and 12 points for each dependent child, up to 3 dependent children. A soldier needed 85 points to be sent back to the States, so it was kind of like a timeshare program, only way less pressure. The men were generally unhappy with the system, which was perceived to be unfair in more than a few ways. Equally frustrating for many was that due to the ongoing war in the Pacific, even those who achieved the 85-point total sometimes had to wait months to catch a ride home. Eventually, the point total was lowered to 50, and just 4 days after Japan surrendered, the U.S. initiated Operation Magic Carpet, presumably under the command of Brigadier General Steppenwolf. Magic Carpet used battleships, carriers, and every other available vessel to bring the boys back home, and demobilization officially ended on June 30th, 1947. Back in the States, the returning soldiers were treated as heroes. Celebrations were routinely held in their honor, and a general state of euphoria spread throughout the nation. But for many of the returning troops themselves, readjustment to normal life was difficult. After fighting on the front lines, many veterans feared they would never be able to adjust back to civilian life. Still others worried they wouldn't be able to find jobs or make up for lost time in their former professions. Even worse, many believed their families would resent their return. To alleviate some of these concerns, the government passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill. Under the new law, all honorably discharged veterans who had seen active duty were eligible to receive a year's worth of unemployment compensation. The bill also encouraged the former soldiers to pursue an education by paying for tuition at a college or vocational school and providing a stipend to live on while they completed their degrees. This caused a dramatic increase in college enrollments across the country. While the original bill expired in 1956, a new version of the bill, the Post-9/11 Veterans Education, passed in 2008. As you might imagine, the invading Soviet soldiers grew to be straight-up terrified of Häyhä. Having to patrol the blanched Finnish wilderness with the knowledge that Häyhä could be out there waiting to ping them with a spectacular long-distance shot earned him the nickname Belje Smert, which is Russian for White Death. However, Häyhä's fellow Finnish soldiers had a completely different name for him. They called him Taika Ampuja, Magic Shooter. While that nickname may have been as accurate as Häyhä himself, we have to admit it is somewhat less intimidating than White Death. Simo's exact sniper count varies depending on the source. Some suggest he downed as many as 542 Soviet soldiers with his rifle, but no one claims he eliminated any less than 505. This makes him the most effective sniper in any war, with Soviet sniper Ivan Sidorenko sitting at a close second with 500 kills. However, Häyhä's count may even be higher. Rather than stay at a comfortable distance behind his sniper rifle for the entire war, Häyhä may have also cut down several hundred enemy combatants with a submachine gun. If true, that would put his count at approximately 800. Simo, that is a frightening number. Impressive, sure, but holy cow, you're really good at your jump. The Winter War lasted for a single winter, as its name suggests, which means Häyhä was putting in serious work. In order to achieve his staggering record, Häyhä was eliminating an average of 5 to 6 enemy soldiers every day. Of course, some days were better than others. Häyhä racked up a terrifying 40 confirmed kills in a single day, scoring 25 and 20 on 2 other record days. The cloud of perpetual death in which he lived saw him promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, the biggest rank jump in the history of Finland's military. Häyhä did not use a scope to forge his legendary sniper count. He preferred to use the plain old iron sight on his rifle. Yeah, no scope. He's just an all-around old-fashioned badass. Beyond being hardcore, there was a strategic reason for this, beyond just showing off. Häyhä recognized that scopes made his enemies an easy target. In addition to making the target slightly bigger, scopes would glint in the sunlight, allowing Häyhä to spot enemy snipers before they spotted him. At the time, every Finnish citizen was required to do 1 year of military service, and Häyhä had done his 14 years earlier, back in 1925. That was the extent of his military experience. He did join the Finnish Civil Guard as reservist, which is essentially the equivalent to the U.S. National Guard, but he stuck to his civilian life of hunting and farming, right up until the Soviets decided to invade in 1939, at which point he was summoned back to service. If his hunting record was anything like his war record, we suspect the deer around Häyhä's home had a nickname for him too. After he completed his year of mandatory service in 1925, Häyhä was given the option to purchase his service weapon, a standard bolt-action rifle. He bought the gun and spent the next decade and a half mastering it. When he was called back to duty during the Winter War, Häyhä brought his old bolt-action rifle, turning down a more modern rifle with advanced optics. The extreme cold, which ranged anywhere from -20 to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, caused frequent weapon malfunctions among his fellow soldiers. But Häyhä's experience with his bolt-action BFF allowed him to keep the gun functional throughout the winter. While only having minimal military experience, Häyhä wasn't possessed by the lord of incredible aim. He developed his skill from being a competitive sharpshooter, having grown up a few miles away from the Civil Guard shooting range, which held annual contests. Häyhä regularly participated in these competitions, packing his house full of trophies. Among his accomplishments was the ability to hit a target with his rifle 16 times in a minute at a range of 500 feet, a talent best described as supernatural. Häyhä was deployed to the Kola battlefield, where he and 31 other soldiers were tasked with holding off an invading force of 4,000 Soviet troops. Despite having fewer men on the roster than a college football team, Häyhä's group managed to hold their ground for the entire winter. That's some good goal line defense right there. He and his fellow Finns had a few other advantages beyond his Angel of Death status as a sniper. For instance, the Soviet troops all wore bright green uniforms, which made them stand out like decorated Christmas trees against the snowy white landscape. What also didn't help the Soviets was they lacked officers with any leadership skills, mainly because Stalin had them all executed when he purged the USSR of any potential political opponents. And even though the Soviet invasion of Finland was technically successful, they only managed to capture a relatively small amount of border territory, leaving the rest of the country intact. All told, the Soviets suffered nearly 400,000 casualties during the Winter War, compared to the 66,000 suffered by Finland. Most snipers shoot while lying flat on their stomachs because it gives enemies a smaller target to aim at. Häyhä fired from a sitting position because he felt the position was better for his aim. He didn't worry too much about making himself a bigger target, as he was just a biscuit over 5 feet tall and would conceal himself in snowbanks and put snow in his mouth to hide his breath. Additionally, Häyhä would pack snow in front of his rifle barrel or pour water on it to freeze it, so that smoke would not rise from it after he fired and give away his position. And in perhaps the biggest departure from sniper etiquette, Rather than going for the head, Häyhä aimed for the center mass of his targets, which is effective in wartime, but won't do him any favors on the Black Ops 4 leaderboards. Häyhä's reputation as the John Wick of Finnish snipers eventually drew the ire of the Soviet commanders, who finally grew tired of his nonsense and began targeting him directly. Because getting anywhere near Häyhä was out of the question, they began hammering his general location with artillery strikes. When those didn't work, the Soviets sent teams of counter-snipers to take him out, but Häyhä, being the song, patched them with bone-chilling ease. Finally, one Soviet sniper got lucky and blasted Häyhä in the jaw with an exploding round. Despite being described by one friend as having half of his head missing, Häyhä refused to die, and after days of reconstructive surgery, he finally regained consciousness, the day after the Winter War had ended. Despite getting a portion of his face blown entirely off his dome in a time when medicine was still largely experimental, Häyhä survived World War II and went back to hunting and farming. The Finnish government actually gave him a farm in 1961, presumably both to reward him for his service, and they probably wanted to stay on his good side. Häyhä took up dog breeding and continued hunting, winning the Ruokalahti Hunting Society's Game Cup 5 years in a row. In 1970, he moved into a small apartment where he lived out the rest of his days before passing away at age 96 in 2002. That's right, the deadliest sniper in World War II lived long enough to have witnessed the rise of popularity of NSYNC. Simo Häyhä left his quiet farm life in the winter of 1939 to become the most effective sniper in history, racking up over 500 confirmed kills without even using a scope before returning home to live out the rest of the 20th century in peace. His real name may have been Forrest Frederick Edward Yo Thomas, but you can call him Rabbit, White Rabbit. FFE Yo Thomas, the espionage agent with the Matrixy nickname, mostly took pictures of top-secret documents behind embassy doors in the wee hours of the morning. After serving 2 years in the UK Royal Air Force, Yo Thomas decided his missions weren't dangerous enough and requested to be sent to occupied France, where he would serve as a liaison between the French government in exile and the resistance. Yo Thomas's first 2 missions went off without a hitch, but during the third, he was betrayed to and captured by the Gestapo. Our hero attempted numerous escapes until he was transferred to Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany, where he survived 8 months of abuse before finally escaping from a work detail. In the process, Yo Thomas led many other POWs to freedom during the last days of the war. Beyond being considered one of the best British spies, Yo Thomas's legacy is cemented by pop culture. Author Ian Fleming was said to have based James Bond on him. In 1930, 22-year-old Krystyna Skarbek was a Miss Poland contest runner-up on her second marriage to writer and politician Jerzy Gajewski. Then, 9 years later, Germany invaded Poland and everything changed. The couple headed for London, where Skarbek ended up working for British intelligence. After establishing a courier system from Poland to Hungary, the fluent French speaker took to France in 1944 under the assumed name Christine Granville. Under this new nom de guerre, Skarbek found herself navigating several intelligence operations. Her most famous jaunt was in Gdynia, where she tricked the Gestapo into releasing 2 captured agents, while her wanted poster was hanging throughout German headquarters. Even for the Nazis, that's embarrassing. Despite being awarded service medals from France and the UK, Skarbek was cut loose from the British government after the war. She was not permitted to return to communist Poland, and her life slowly spiraled out of control. She ended up living in a cruise ship hotel in 1952, where she was the victim of foul play by rejected suitor Dennis Muldowney. In 1935, Wilhelm Canaris thought Adolf Hitler was the bee's knees. He was even appointed the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence. Then Canaris got a front row seat to Hitler's World War II atrocities and changed his tune real fast. To right these many wrongs, Canaris started to collect like-minded opponents in the Abwehr and the military. He participated in several plots to eliminate the Führer, making sure to distance himself enough from the plan so he wouldn't be implicated. In 1944, another failed plot on Hitler's life took place, and the Führer did away with the Abwehr entirely. This time, Canaris's luck ran out, and he was tattled on by others who were tortured for the information. Canaris went to prison, but refused to admit guilt until early April 1945, when his incriminating diaries were discovered. So Canaris and his co-conspirators were rounded up and hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945. Nazis reading someone's private diary. Is there any low they won't stoop to? Odette Dalloz was born in France in 1912, moving to Britain after marrying an Englishman in 1931. 11 years later, based on the strength of some of her wartime photographs, Odette was recruited into British espionage outfit, the Special Operatives Executive. Dalloz was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 and was subjected to torture at the notorious Fresnes prison near Paris. Throughout multiple interrogations, Dalloz refused to reveal the whereabouts of other agents in the field, so she was given an all-expenses-paid trip to Ravensbrück concentration camp. After months of beatings and isolation, Dalloz spun a tale about her relation to Winston Churchill, telling her captors that her co-spy, Captain Peter Churchill, was Winston's nephew and that she was his wife, making her the English Prime Minister's niece-in-law. SS officer Fritz Zurin, the guy who ran the camp, bought the story hook, line, and sinker and decided this was his out from the Nazi party. He drove Dalloz personally to the American lines to drop her off and surrender, hoping her status would save him from the consequences of his actions. It did not. Dalloz ended up testifying against Zurin and anyone else who made her life hell in Ravensbrück. For her actions, Dalloz became the first woman to receive the George Cross for acts of the greatest heroism or of the most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger. The husband and wife team of Hiroo and Libertas Schulze-Boysen hated the Third Reich. Both came from upper-class German backgrounds, with Hiroo being the son of a decorated naval officer, and Libertas being the daughter of German nobility. These family connections allowed Hiroo to secure a position in the Reich Air Ministry in 1934, and once they had an in, they began forming a squad of like-minded anti-Nazis. As the 1940s approached, their private opposition quickly graduated to legitimate espionage, with large amounts of intel passing between them, the Soviets, and the U.S. government. This prompted the nickname the Red Orchestra, named because of how they would sing to Soviet Russia. Libertas would use her position in the German film industry to document evidence of German war crimes and pass it on via radio. But in 1942, one operative broadcast from the same place twice, which led to the Gestapo being able to locate and arrest the group, decoding messages to figure out who else was involved. The Gestapo spent the rest of that summer hunting down all the members of the resistance cell they could, eventually arresting Hiroo at the Air Ministry on August 31, 1942. And 3 days before Christmas, all captured members of the Schulze-Boysen espionage club were eliminated. Aside from inspiring the Best Picture winner, the Manhattan Project made a lot of people nervous back in 1944. This was what kicked off Operation Magpie, the Reich's attempt to find out everything they could about the progress of the project. The plan was simple. Use a submarine to offload spies Erich Gimpel and William Kolpaugh near the American town of Hancock, Maine. Did we say simple? We meant really weird. After landing in snowy Maine, the pair of spies made it to New York within 2 days, which is honestly impressive. They were given $60,000 for their mission, equivalent to about 650,000 smackaroos today, which allowed them to rent an apartment in Manhattan, probably a studio, with no storage space. As is always a great undoer of mankind, Green reared its ugly head and ruined the plan for both men. Kolpaugh stole most of the cash and went on a drunken bender that ended up outing both spies and getting them arrested by December 30th. The two received death sentences. But since President Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't the biggest fan of capital punishment, the sentences were commuted. Morris Moe Berg was a baseball player and coach from 1923 to 1939. Aside from being a baller, Berg was highly intelligent and multilingual, accompanying teams and players to Japan for a tour and exhibition game. On one 1934 trip, Berg filmed Tokyo and its harbor from a rooftop. By the time World War II broke out, Berg had a law degree and was involved in various counterintelligence efforts, eventually providing his film footage of Tokyo to the U.S. Army unit that planned the 1942 Doolittle raid, but not the one where animals talk. Berg was then parachuted into enemy territory in Yugoslavia to find a way to deter German progress of atomic weapons. To accomplish this, Berg placed all his focus on German physicist Werner Heisenberg. You know, the one who knocks? In fact, Berg was set to eliminate Heisenberg while he was delivering a lecture. With a concealed pistol in his pocket and a cyanide pill in his possession, Berg watched the lecture and determined that Heisenberg had not yet developed any weapon, and the assassination was put on hold. Talk about leaving things until the last minute. After the war ended, Berg was awarded and declined the Presidential Medal of Freedom, since he wasn't exactly at liberty to share the secret of why he deserved it. After his intelligence contract expired in the 50s, Berg spent the next 20 years with friends and relatives, remaining coy about whether or not he was still working on top-secret missions. He passed away in 1972 at the age of 70, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which was donated to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Albanian national Ilyesa Bosna was hired as a valet by the British ambassador to Turkey. And his new boss, the stereotypically British named Sir Hugh Knatchbull Hugeson, was notorious for bringing home sensitive, classified documents. With his new codenamed Cicero, Bosna made some cash on the side by photographing and selling these top-secret documents to Germany throughout 1944. This side hustle brought in some serious scratch, too, with Bosna earning the highest amount ever paid to a spy up until that point. Eventually, the specific details of the leaks had all signs pointing to the Ankara embassy as the source. While they had Bosna seemingly dead to rights, he was able to narrowly avoid detection during the war. After the war, Bosna learned the hard way about selling secrets to the Reich, when any new business ventures failed due to counterfeit payments from the Germans. He tried suing the government for what he was owed, but when that failed, he spent the rest of his days as a night watchman. Londoner Harold Coe had a real roller coaster of a career, starting off a villain before becoming a hero, only to end his tale as a villain again. Like a quote from a Batman movie. Cole was a former convict who enlisted in the British Army after his release. In an irony to end all ironies, Cole again found himself prisoner after being captured during the German invasion of France in 1940. He was able to escape his imprisonment and hide out in Marseille, and worked to help his fellow soldiers by establishing escape lines with the French resistance. With Cole's help, several individuals were able to escape occupied France for a better life. Score one for Cole. Cole was captured yet again, but this time the Gestapo was able to flip him to become an informer, no longer working for the French resistance, but directly against them. 50 of the captured resistance fighters were executed by the Germans as a result. Okay, I guess we have to take that point away from him. After the war, the British and French were understandably annoyed with Cole and set out to hunt him down. He was captured and placed in a NATO prison in Paris, only to escape again in November of 1945. French police eventually found him on January 8, 1946, and eliminated him. He now rests in an unmarked pauper's grave. War is truly hell, even for spies like us. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed day-to-day life in Hawaii for years afterward. Within hours, the Army declared martial law throughout the territory, and at 6 p.m. that evening, a strict curfew went into effect. The Army even ordered all public places closed, including bars. But that was just the beginning. The Army actually went as far as to temporarily prohibit the sale of alcohol throughout the entire state. Schools were closed, and all food sales were suspended so the military could inventory the island's food stocks. Gasoline rations went into effect almost immediately. And while that state of martial law was a response to the attack, it would remain in effect in Hawaii until 1944. The first report about the Pearl Harbor attack reached the mainland around 2 p.m. Eastern Time on December 7, 1941. Short and to the point, it read, "Air Raid, Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." President Roosevelt was one of the first to learn of the attack from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. In fact, it all happened so fast, the attack was actually still in progress as Roosevelt began to weigh his next move. He called Press Secretary Steve Early and ordered him to release a statement to the media, which still hadn't learned of the bombings. Early put together a three-way call with the major news services, and their first bulletin went out at 2:22 p.m. It read,
Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Once the news was out, it spread like wildfire. Radio networks across the country even cut into their broadcasts to report on the emerging situation. As the attack continued, a reporter with NBC's Honolulu affiliate climbed onto the roof of the Honolulu Advertiser building. Carrying a microphone and a telephone, the reporter phoned in the first eyewitness account of the attack. The battle had been raging for 3 hours at that point, and the reporter told viewers, many of whom were initially skeptical that the U.S. would really be attacked, that
it is no joke, it is the real war.
This first eyewitness account was quickly followed by reports of Japanese airstrikes in Thailand and the Philippines. The Japanese were also sending soldiers into Hong Kong to seize the British colony. It was a massive, coordinated effort, and it seemed to be working. Working in concert with the military, FBI agents quickly descended on Hawaii to round up suspicious persons. And round them up they did. Within 40 hours of the attack, more than 2,000 people were detained. And with the state under martial law, these people had no right to habeas corpus or a trial by jury. One suspect was 13-year-old Walter Oka, a Japanese-American accused of tracking military ships in the days before the attack. FBI agents descended on Oka's home, but once they realized he was just a child, they dropped the investigation, and hopefully felt pretty embarrassed about the whole thing. All the images of the Pearl Harbor bombing were immediately censored. Military personnel seized both still and motion pictures of the attack, and by noon, the Army had blocked the transmission of any unauthorized information about the raid. As reports of the attack on Pearl Harbor began to fill the radio, listeners across the country panicked. Among the genuine information was plenty of misinformation, and the false reports only fueled the chaos. CBS News incorrectly reported that Japanese paratroopers had been spotted in Honolulu and had been sighted off Harbor Point. The same station reported a handful of civilian casualties in Honolulu and dive bombers attacking the city from a Japanese aircraft carrier. They also claimed that aerial dogfights were raging in the skies over Honolulu. None of it was true, but at the moment, the general public had no way of knowing that, and the misinformation fueled anxiety about the extent of the attack. As everyone's fear-based reactions kicked in, Japanese Americans quickly fell under blanket suspicion. This made things extra complicated, since in Hawaii at the time, 37% of all residents were of Japanese heritage. These people were heavily scrutinized, and even President Roosevelt promoted the idea of removing all Japanese people from the island of Oahu. However, the military realized such a roundup would be impractical and would affect the labor division on the island. Later in 1942, Roosevelt would force 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent living on the mainland to live in internment camps during World War II. Out of fear, Japanese people living on the islands hid anything that linked them to Japan. Members of the Nakasone household, for example, made sure they didn't have any images of the Japanese emperor. Jane Kurihara, who was a child living in Honolulu at the time, later recalled that she wasn't supposed to speak Japanese anymore, saying it was almost like a sin. In San Francisco, Upton Close, an NBC radio personality, phoned the Japanese consulate to find out more about the attack. On the phone, the Consul General's secretary, Kazuyoshi Inagaki, said the attack was a complete surprise to the consulate. On the air, Close himself speculated that the claim could be true. He reasoned that it was easily possible that the bombing was a coup engineered by a small portion of the Japanese Navy that had gone fanatic. He even asserted that it might be possible for the Japanese government to repudiate the action and repair the injury to America. However, inside the consulate, panicking Japanese officials were burning sensitive documents. The blaze grew out of control, and the fire department was called to put out the fire. Americans on the West Coast, the closest part of the mainland U.S. to Japan, worried about additional attacks. On the afternoon of the bombing, San Francisco's NBC station reported that there was no indication whatsoever that any sabotage had taken place, or that any Japanese spies or saboteurs were at work. Not taking any chances, in Los Angeles, the county sheriff rushed to Little Tokyo to take charge of the district. According to reports, the sheriff gathered up a number of volunteers and set up a watching post to keep an eye on the Japanese. But they didn't see anything that required any kind of action. In fact, people on both sides of the fence remained calm and decent. Not surprising when you remember they were also all Americans. Meanwhile, back in Hawaii, the military wasn't taking any risks. Worried that Japanese Americans could be loyal to Japan after the attack, the military ordered all Japanese residents to turn over banned items. This included radios and binoculars that might be used to signal Japanese forces, as well as any firearms. Japanese Americans were suddenly enemies in their own country, and with martial law declared, they had no right to defend themselves in court. As night fell on the West Coast, the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, concerned about being attacked, observed a blackout. Residents were asked to turn off all their lights once it was dark so that enemy aircraft couldn't identify cities. Civilian radio stations also went off the air, since aircraft could also locate cities using radio waves. When darkness fell in Seattle, radio station KIRO announced that every light of any kind in the area must be out by 11 o'clock. Residents were informed that to test their blackout, they would have plenty of time between the hours of 7 and 11. This time was to be used, among other things, to get heavy black paper and heavy drapes to seal windows. No headlights were to be used on automobiles, and no lights whatsoever were to be showing anywhere on the Pacific coast until 30 minutes after daylight. In Seattle, people took the blackout very seriously. In fact, when it went into effect, a mob targeted businesses that did not turn out their lights, leading to a riot. It began at 4th Avenue and Pike Street downtown. The lighted letters of the Foreman and Clark store shone even during the blackout. A crowd gathered, throwing rocks at the lights. Over the course of an hour, rioters smashed most of the 12-letter sign, then moved on to other lights. Teenager Ethel Chelsvig soon became the leader of the mob. She shouted, "Break them, turn them out," and asked the crowd if they would really just stand by and do nothing while the lights threatened the very life of the city. Chelsvig was detained, and when questioned by the police, she told them, "This is war. One light in the city might betray us." She was eventually fined $25 for disorderly conduct. Newsrooms quickly prepared their headline stories on the Pearl Harbor attack. Typographers searched for their largest typefaces. Around the country, the headlines read, "War," and readers snatched up the papers the morning after the attack. The San Francisco Chronicle concluded, "If war had to come, it is perhaps well that it came this way. Wanton, unwarned, in fraud, and under a flag of truce." And in the Los Angeles Times, an editorial read, "Japan has asked for it. It was the act of a mad dog, a gangster's parody of every principle of international honor." On the morning of December 8, 1941, less than 24 hours after the attack, President Roosevelt gave a speech to a joint session of Congress. The speech went down in history for Roosevelt's assertion that December 7th would be a day that would live in infamy. He asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, and they gave him one that very day. 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the U.S. The rest, as they say, is history. In the early days of World War II, the Soviet Union, eager to scoop up more territory, invaded Finland with about 1 million soldiers. Hey, when opportunity knocks, you'd better answer. Sometimes that knock is a world war. They bombarded the Finnish people with artillery to weaken their defenses, who, thanks to their small number of outdated batteries, had no chance of returning fire in any meaningful way. The Soviets also entered the country with several armored divisions, and more than enough ammunition to eradicate the population of the country many times over. Yet despite this overwhelming material advantage, by the time the war was over, the Soviets couldn't retreat from Finland fast enough. the Winter War would last less than a year, but it resulted in more horrors than other entire regions saw during the duration of World War II. For even though they were facing an overwhelming invasion force from a militarily superior enemy, the Finns stayed and fought to defend their homeland with little more than grit and determination on their side, and extreme cold. Never underestimate the power of bad weather. They stopped at nothing to beat their enemies. Self-destruction, gruesome improvisation, and psychological warfare were all parts of their guerrilla campaign to stop the Russian invasion. The Russians invaded Finland with a ton of tanks at the ready, while the Finns had almost no armored units at their disposal. In terms of the board game Risk, they were stuck in Scandinavia with no cards and a handful of infantry units. But if you thought the Finns were going to let that stop them, well, you're right, at least as far as their tanks were concerned. The Finns did manage to field a few of their tanks for an early morning attack, but the tanks were not equipped with radios. This made any kind of battlefield coordination nearly impossible. Furthermore, some of those tanks had to fall back due to technical problems, and some ended up getting stuck on terrain, like RoboCop's ED-209 trying to navigate a staircase. Still, this did not stop the tenacious Finns from launching an attack on the Russians, but heavy losses forced them to withdraw after just a few hours. Their inferior numbers, lack of hardware, and inexperienced crews meant their armored division stood no chance against the Russians. So what do you do when your enemy's tanks are too good? You make it so they can't use them. The Finns knew that mobility was the key to winning the Winter War, and while the Finns kept to the harder, snowier regions of the countryside, the Red Army had to stick to the roads on account of their tanks and trucks. Should have brought more ATVs. Knowing that with all of their heavy equipment, the Russians would have to use the country's infrastructure to move around, the Finns simply destroyed it. In the autumn of 1939, the Finns destroyed as many roads and bridges as they could in anticipation of the Russian invasion. They also tried to tear down any structure that would be able to house their troops from the cold outside. The Finns went even so far as to make entire towns unlivable by poisoning drinking water and booby-trapping areas with mines. Their strategy worked, and Soviet troops suffered from the first day of the invasion. But wrecking the place wasn't the only tactic the Finns used against Russian tanks. The general idea of the Molotov cocktail had been around since the Spanish Civil War, and while it does kind of sound like something they served at the 2014 Winter Olympics, it's actually an improvised explosive device made by filling a glass bottle with a flammable liquid, like gasoline or alcohol, and a source of ignition, like a kerosene-soaked cloth. The Finns perfected the recipe for this IED and gave it its popular nickname. So, why is it called a Molotov cocktail? Well, during the early days of the Winter War, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, insisted that Soviet planes were actually dropping supplies, rather than bombs, on Finland. Well, bombs are technically supplies, depending on how they're delivered. The Finns started ironically calling Soviet bombs Molotov's picnic baskets, and eventually started referring to their own IEDs as Molotov cocktails. Contrary to popular belief, Molotov cocktails weren't used against infantry. Their primary use was to take out Soviet tanks. Finnish cocktails added tar to the flammable liquid, which produced heavy smoke. The explosives would shatter against the tanks, sending smoke into the interior and making it impossible for the drivers or gunners to breathe. Made up of outdated planes, the Finnish Air Force was small and weak compared to the Soviets, and had little hope of taking the Russians head-on. So, they didn't. Instead, they used similar tactics as in their guerrilla ground campaign. The aircraft, of which there were far too few, were typically only used in a defensive capacity, or to conduct precision attacks on small formations. This strategy proved to be extremely effective. All in all, the FAF, including bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes, flew about 5,900 combat missions during the war and shot down 190 enemies, losing 47 of their own planes in the process. That's roughly 4 Russian planes eliminated for every Finnish one. Not too shabby for a ramshackle air force. The Finns used anything and everything at their disposal to win the war with the Soviets. Usually in conflicts such as these, there was a gentleman's agreement between both sides that would allow them to retrieve and bury their dead during periods of ceasefire. But if the Finns were going to have a chance to beat the Soviets, they were going to have to break the rules. They were waging a guerrilla campaign, and that meant striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. So the Finns would take the frozen bodies of fallen Russians and prop them up for their comrades to find, like skeletons in a haunted funhouse. This had a devastating impact on enemy morale. Not only were the Russians horrified to find the frozen corpses of their comrades, but it also made it clear that the Finns would do whatever it took to win. But despite enduring these frightening tactics and sustaining heavy losses, the Soviets were absolutely determined to break the Finnish lines, and they threw everything they had at achieving that objective. Take, for example, the large infantry invasion launched by the Russians near the Taipale River. The Soviets pulled out all the stops to get the job done. But Finnish ski troopers used their mobility and expert knowledge of the terrain to set up automatic weapon emplacements. Yeah, ski troopers. An idea that is both extremely practical and completely badass. You get to shred the enemy and some powder. As the Soviets advanced, the Finns mowed them down in droves for days. Casualties were so high, the Russians were forced to use the frozen bodies of their fallen comrades as cover from the machine guns. Both sides really got a lot of use out of those corpsicles. While the Russians had larger numbers and superior technology, they were also a lumbering force that was slow to move. The Finns took advantage of their superior mobility and adopted a hit-and-run mentality. Practically speaking, this meant that the Finns would draw large pockets of the Soviet army after them, then break apart and surround them. Kind of like the raptors in Jurassic Park. After the Finns surrounded the invaders, it was just a question of wearing them down with long-range fire from all directions. Between this tactic and the extreme cold, more on that in a bit, the Russians found themselves mired in a war of attrition they simply couldn't win. Speaking of attrition, the Finns used many snipers during the Winter War, but no one in their army, or the entire history of warfare, matched the overwhelming efficiency of Simo Häyhä. You remember him, right? We mispronounced his name for an entire episode on Weird History. I remember that. Got a lot of comments. I'm trying to do a better job this time. A farmer and a hunter, he had won awards for his marksmanship and was called into military service during the invasion. Adorned in white camouflage and using his iron-sighted Mosin Nagant M91, Häyhä became the deadliest sniper the world has ever known. He found sniper perches within view of important roads. Since the Soviets couldn't travel through the thick snow, he would then wait for targets to appear, sometimes even staying in place for days on end. In fact, his patience saved his life several times, including a time he was engaged in a day-long sniper fight with a Soviet marksman. By the end of the war, he had racked up over 500 confirmed kills. His ruthlessness earned him the nickname the White Death, a nickname he notably shares with the shark from Jaws. Despite the fact that they vastly outnumbered the Finns, the smaller country's guerrilla tactics eventually overwhelmed the Soviets, and after a while, the superior troop numbers of the Russians meant nothing. In total, the Finns lost about 26,000 soldiers between the fighting and the harsh elements, with another 44,000 wounded. The Soviet casualties, on the other hand, are a bit harder to pin down. In 1940, the official count, according to the Soviets, was about 49,000 KIA and 158,000 sick and wounded. In 1997, Russian military historian Grigory Krivosayev put the numbers at about 127,000 KIA, or MIA, and 189,000 sick or wounded. Historian Pavel Petrov claimed in 2013 that the Russian State Military Archive confirmed approximately 167,000 dead or missing. This means that almost half of the Soviet army was wounded or killed by an enemy force less than half their size, with much worse equipment. One of the biggest tactical mistakes the Germans made was invading Russia and staying for the winter. So you'd think the Russians themselves would know enough not to make the same exact mistake. But they didn't. In fact, they committed pretty much the exact same blunder in their invasion of Finland. Maybe they figured that as Russians, they were immune to the cold, like polar bears or the deadly ninja Sub-Zero. The winter between 1939 and 1940 was especially unforgiving, with temperatures plummeting to negative 45 degrees Celsius during mid-January. Imagine trying to do anything in those conditions, let alone sit in a trench. The weather also caused some serious problems with Russian machinery. The lubricants in vehicles froze, which meant that the car-reliant Red Army lost mobility. Artillery also became harder to operate, as the fluid in the recoil system began to freeze as well. Basically, anything that could freeze did freeze. Finally, it's worth mentioning that the soldiers who first fought the invading Russians were not officially part of the Finnish army. They were essentially an unorganized militia, defending against an attack comparable in scale to the Allied invasion of Normandy. They had shortages of equipment, ammunition, and even uniforms. Most were dressed in civilian winter gear, wearing skis and armed with their personal hunting rifles. And they fought off one of the fiercest world powers of the mid-20th century, permanently crossing Invade Finland off the Soviet Union's vision board. At 6 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, November 26, 1941, a massive Japanese carrier fleet left Hirokapu Bay and set off on a top-secret mission. They charted a route toward Hawaii through the empty northern Pacific Ocean, which took them through near-freezing temperatures. For the next 12 days, the fleet would enforce strict radio silence, so no one could possibly figure out that the attack was coming. Cold bunks and no radio are the prices you pay for secrecy. At nearly the same time, American Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented the Japanese government with a diplomatic request to withdraw troops, which became known as the Hull Note. Japanese Prime Minister Tojo Hideki responded to the note by telling his cabinet, "This is an ultimatum." At 3:42 a.m. on December 7th, just hours before the strike, the American ship the USS Condor spotted a Japanese submarine near Pearl Harbor. The Condor, which was a minesweeper, directly observed the sub and even spotted its periscope, which was quickly reported to a destroyer, the USS Ward. The world wouldn't know the full story for some time to come, but the Japanese actually spent months planning the Pearl Harbor strike. And on the morning of December 7th, the fleet took its final position 275 miles north of its target. Then, at 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes took off. The air attackers included fighter aircraft, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The first wave was led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who later recalled that it took his squadron an hour and 40 minutes after leaving the carriers to reach the first sight of land. Then, suddenly, a long white line of breaking surf appeared directly beneath his plane. He had spotted the northern shore of Oahu. It was at 6:45 a.m., while the first Japanese bombers were still on their way toward Pearl Harbor, that the USS Ward finally located and sank the Japanese submarine that had been spotted by the USS Condor a few hours earlier. It marked the first casualties of the strike, and it likely felt like a win for the American forces. Spotting and sinking an enemy submarine would be a huge ego boost on any other day. But the crew of the Ward still had no idea about the full extent of what was coming, or the devastation that was about to unfold. Now, you may not know that the Japanese attack was almost completely foiled by Mother Nature. Choppy water nearly doomed the entire strike. It's hard to believe, but according to pilot Tokuji Izuka, the carriers were rolling considerably, pitching and yawing. Under such conditions, it was very difficult to carry out takeoff operations. In other words, it would be tough to play checkers in those conditions, let alone fly a plane off a ship. Izuka himself left the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Akagi around 7 a.m., along with a second wave of planes. It took 2 hours for the attackers to fly to Oahu, and by the time they arrived, the attack was already in progress. Just after 7 a.m., American forces finally spotted the planes from the Opana Mobile Radar Station. Run by the Army, the radar station on Oahu served as an early warning system. You would think that when the Army's early warning radar station calls to issue an early warning, the necessary people would immediately jump into action. Yet, when the radar operators called the United States Army Pacific's headquarters in Fort Shafter, Honolulu, to report the unusual reading, they were told to honor the military's regimented chain of command and to wait for a return phone call from a commanding officer before acting. "20 minutes later, at 7:20 a.m., an officer at Fort Shafter finally responded to the radar sighting of Japanese planes. Tragically, the officer dismissed the blip as an incoming group of U.S. B-17 bombers flying in from California, because the Flying Fortress bombers were indeed scheduled to arrive that morning. So the lieutenant who called back the Opana operator told him not to worry about the reading, a decision he would come to regret mere minutes later. Only minutes before the first bombs dropped, At 7:33 a.m., U.S. intelligence forces deciphered a critical Japanese code. Codebreakers learned that the Japanese negotiators were told to stop all talks with the U.S. And when the military officers saw the deciphered message, they quickly concluded the Japanese might soon strike. Army General George C. Marshall immediately contacted the forces in Hawaii. He was desperate to warn the troops, believing this code-breaking report showed clear evidence that the Japanese were moving toward war. But due to atmospheric conditions, Marshall made the decision to send the information via commercial telegraph, specifically through Western Union's undersea cable. It arrived too late, and by the time anyone saw it, the attack was already underway. Minutes before 8 a.m., Commander Fuchida gave the order for the first wave of planes to strike their targets. In his own words, "It was 07:49 when I ordered my radio man to send the command, attack, and he immediately began tapping out the prearranged code signal." In an attempt to prevent a U.S. response, the first targets included the airfields on Oahu, but the bombs also fell on the U.S. fleet moored in the harbor, and the results would be devastating. Only minutes before the first bombs dropped, Japanese Commander Fuchida signaled "Tora, Tora, Tora" to his ship. The signal communicated the success of the strike so far. It meant that the planes had arrived at Oahu without being spotted, and the strike would commence as a total surprise to the Americans. At 7:55 a.m., from his position on Ford Island, Naval Commander Logan C. Ramsey saw a low-flying plane. At first, the commander thought he had spotted a drill being conducted by American forces, but then he spotted the plane dropping a bomb. Ramsey transmitted a telegraph message that read, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill." It was sent at the exact same moment that the first bombs struck their targets, and America quickly endured its first casualties. On the USS West Virginia, Naval Lieutenant James W. Downing watched fellow sailors blowing off the ship, coming out of the water and igniting due to the oil on their bodies. In his words, they just became human torches. A few minutes after 8 a.m., the Japanese fighters dropped the first bomb on the USS Arizona. The incendiary device hit the rear of the ship, bouncing off one of the gun turrets before exploding through 3 decks. A second bomb struck close to the anti-aircraft deck. A third hit on the port side. Then at least 3 bombs fell harmlessly in the water. But the fourth hit on the Arizona detonated the powder stores, causing a massive explosion. Naval Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, Husband E. Kimmel, walked out of his home into his yard at 7:55 a.m. There, with little else he could do, he just watched as Japanese aircraft targeted the U.S. fleet. Kimmel's next-door neighbor said the Admiral's face was as white as the uniform he wore. Minutes later, at 8:12 a.m., Kimmel addressed the fleet over the radio, telling them hostilities with Japan had commenced due to an air raid on Pearl Harbor. He then called in his offshore fleet and reported the strike to the Navy. On the deck of the Arizona, the American sailors did their best to man the anti-aircraft guns while the Japanese bombers strafed the deck with bullets. Crewman John Anderson later recalled thinking that they just couldn't sit there and wait for the ship to go down. He believed they had to do something, but he didn't have time to figure out what that was. At 8:19 a.m., a bomb struck the powder stores and split the ship's hull, beginning the Arizona sinking, causing 1,177 American casualties. It was over an hour into the Pearl Harbor strike at 9 a.m. when the second wave of Japanese fighters descended. The dive bombers in the second wave targeted the ships still floating in the harbor, while larger planes carrying torpedoes and bombs targeted the air bases. And as the dive bombers circled the ships, the rest of the planes dropped high-altitude bombs onto the bases. Between the first bombs at 8 a.m. and the final ones at 9:55 a.m., the attack on Pearl Harbor damaged all 8 U.S. battleships in the harbor. Multiple ships sank, taking sailors with them. The strike also wiped out 170 planes and inflicted more than 3,500 American casualties. As the Japanese planes withdrew and ships continued to burn in the harbor, the focus quickly shifted to recovering from one of the most devastating military attacks in history. That included a year-long salvage operation led by Naval Commander Homer N. Wallen, which rebuilt what boats they could and turned the shipwreck of the USS Arizona into a war memorial. The battleship remains there to this day. President Franklin D. Roosevelt learned of the Pearl Harbor attack in the early afternoon of December 7th. The next day, at 7:30 a.m., he gave a 6-minute speech to Congress, in which he famously declared December 7th, 1941 to be a date which will live in infamy. He ended his speech with an open plea to declare war. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Later that day, the United States Congress followed their president's impassioned advice and officially declared war on Japan. They really couldn't say no after that speech. In the Senate, the declaration received a unanimous vote, but one member of the House of Representatives voted no. That member was Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin, who was the first woman elected to Congress, and used this fact to explain her vote, saying, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." On December 11, 1941, 4 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. earned unanimous votes in Congress to declare war against Germany and Italy, entering World War II and ending America's long-standing isolationist policies. That's where our video ends. But, 80-year-old spoiler alert, the good guys won. So what do you think? Which part of this story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our Weird History.